Rain hammered against the windshield like shards of glass, a relentless rhythm that filled the night with sound and sorrow. The wipers fought to keep up, slashing back and forth in a losing battle against the storm. Inside the sleek black car, Daniel Hayes gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. The glow of city lights bled through the rain, stretching into distorted streaks that shimmered like ghosts. He had just left a meeting that ended in victory. A merger sealed, another empire folded neatly into his own. By all accounts, he should have felt triumphant. But the thrill that used to come from power had long since died. The silence in the car pressed against him, cold and suffocating. He didn't even turn on the radio anymore. Music reminded him of her, his wife, and of laughter he could never hear again. He drove through the heart of the city, past empty intersections and shuttered shops. It was nearly midnight. The storm had driven everyone inside. Everyone except one. As he rounded a corner, his headlights cut across a narrow side street and froze. Someone was huddled against a lamppost. A small figure curled tight, head buried between trembling knees. For a split second, he thought it was a pile of discarded clothes. Then the figure shifted. A hand moved. Daniel slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching on wet asphalt before coming to a halt. For a moment, he just sat there, chest heaving, staring into the blur of rain. His instinct screamed to keep driving. This wasn't his concern. He didn't stop for strangers. He didn't get involved. But something, a flicker of memory, a voice from another life, anchored him in place. His daughter's giggle. The sound of small feet running across hardwood floors. The way she'd once clung to his leg during a thunderstorm. That memory sliced through the fog in his mind. Before he could stop himself, he opened the car door. The wind caught it instantly, slamming rain against his suit. The cold hit him like a slap. He stepped out, water rising around his expensive shoes, and moved toward the lamppost. "Hey," he called softly. No response. Only the storm. "Are you hurt?" The figure stirred. A thin, shaking voice broke the night. "Please." A pause. Then barely audible. "Please don't hit me." Daniel froze. The words tore through him with brutal precision, leaving him breathless. The little girl lifted her head just enough for the light to catch her face. Her hair clung to her cheeks in wet strands. Her eyes, huge, dark, terrified, looked far older than her small body. She couldn't have been more than 8. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, kneeling despite the rain soaking his suit. His voice cracked in a way it hadn't in years. "You're safe, all right?" She shook her head, pressing her back tighter against the post as if the world itself were closing in. Daniel took off his jacket and held it out. "Here, it's warm." Her eyes darted to it, suspicious, waiting for the trick, the punishment. When he draped it gently over her shoulders, she flinched but didn't pull away. The fabric swallowed her, the dark wool already slick with rain. "Where's your family?" he asked softly. Her lips trembled. "I don't have one." He felt it then, a crack deep inside him, like ice breaking. Something fragile and long buried stirred. His throat tightened as he stared at this child, fragile, soaked, yet alive. Alone, just like he had been for so long. "Come with me," he heard himself say, his tone more certain than his thoughts. "You'll freeze out here." She hesitated, then nodded slowly, more out of exhaustion than trust. Daniel stood and offered his hand. For a moment she only stared at it, uncertain what touch meant anymore. Then trembling, she reached out. Her small cold fingers slid into his. As they walked toward the car, rain cascaded around them like a curtain, washing the night clean. Daniel opened the door and guided her in gently. When he looked at her again, she was clutching his jacket like a shield, eyes heavy with exhaustion. He got behind the wheel and started the engine. The city lights blurred past once more, but this time he noticed them. Every flash of color, every reflection in the puddles seemed to whisper of something he had forgotten. Humanity. The girl's head tilted, her voice barely a breath. "Thank you for not leaving me." Daniel's grip tightened around the wheel. He didn't know her name, her story, or what horrors she had escaped. All he knew was that leaving her would have haunted him forever. And somewhere between the thunder and the hum of the engine, he realized his life, defined by control, silence, and grief, had just changed course. The storm outside raged on, but inside that car, a new promise had been born. The mansion of silence. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time Daniel's car turned off the main road. The iron gates of the Hayes estate loomed ahead, slick with water, reflecting the pale sweep of the headlights. As the gates creaked open, the sound echoed through the storm like the groan of a waking beast. The driveway stretched long and dark, lined with ancient oaks swaying beneath the wind. At the end stood the mansion, 3 stories of cold stone and glass, majestic and lifeless. Laya sat silent in the passenger seat, Daniel's jacket still wrapped around her tiny frame. Her wet hair clung to her face, her lips pale and trembling. Every rumble of thunder made her flinch. Daniel glanced at her from the corner of his eye, the faint rise and fall of her breathing barely visible. Something about her stillness unnerved him. It was the stillness of someone who had learned that being quiet was safer than being noticed. When he parked, the motionless house stared back at them, all sharp lines and empty windows. It was beautiful, but it looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Daniel turned off the ignition and sat for a long moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. He hadn't brought anyone here since the funeral. No guests, no friends, no one. And now, a child. He stepped out and circled the car. When he opened the door, Laya recoiled instinctively, pressing herself against the seat. He paused, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "It's all right," he said softly. "You don't have to be afraid." Her wide eyes lifted toward him, full of uncertainty. Then slowly she took his hand again. Her fingers were so light it barely felt real, like holding a ghost. Inside, the mansion was a cathedral of quiet. The grand foyer gleamed with marble floors, and a chandelier hung above them like frozen light. Rain dripped faintly from Daniel's coat onto the tiles, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. Laya's eyes darted everywhere, to the portraits on the walls, the wide staircase, the tall windows that stared into the storm. To her, it must have looked like a palace. But Daniel saw what he always saw, a monument to emptiness. The staff appeared one by one, their shock barely hidden. Daniel Hayes never brought company home. "Certainly not a child, sir?" asked Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, her voice cautious. "No questions," Daniel said simply, his tone clipped but calm. "Prepare a guest room. Something warm, food, now." The woman nodded and hurried away. Laya watched the exchange silently, her eyes following every movement like a frightened animal waiting for a trap to spring. Daniel led her up the staircase himself. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last. When they reached the second floor, he opened a door to a room he had never entered since his daughter's death. A soft pastel space with white curtains and a small bed. It smelled faintly of dust and lavender. Laya stopped at the threshold. "Is this mine?" she whispered. Daniel hesitated. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals, that simple question disarmed him completely. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yes," he said finally. "It's yours." Her lip trembled, her fingers gripping the jacket tighter. "For how long?" He blinked. "For as long as you need." A tear rolled down her cheek before she could hide it. The staff brought food, soup, bread, a glass of warm milk. Laya stared at it, not touching it at first, as if she thought it was a trick. When she finally picked up the spoon, her hand shook. She ate in silence, but every few bites she glanced up at Daniel, as though expecting him to snatch it away. He sat nearby, pretending to look at his phone but really just watching her. The way she hunched protectively over her meal, the way she flinched at every distant thunderclap. Something inside him twisted painfully. After she finished, she set the spoon down carefully, eyes darting toward him. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "For what? For eating too much?" Daniel exhaled, leaning forward. "Laya," he said quietly, "you never have to apologize for eating. Do you understand me?" She nodded slowly, but didn't meet his gaze. The way she said nothing spoke louder than any scream. As the night deepened, Laya curled under the blanket, clutching his jacket like it was armor. Daniel lingered by the doorway, unable to leave. The sight of her, and fragile, asleep but still tense, tore through him like lightning. He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "You won't send me away, will you?" she asked, eyes half open, the question trembling in the air. Daniel's throat tightened. He crossed the room and knelt beside her bed. "No," he said, voice steady but heavy. "I promise you you're safe here." Her eyes fluttered closed. A tear slipped from the corner of one, catching the faint light from the lamp. Daniel stood there long after she fell asleep. Outside, the last of the rain pattered against the window, soft and rhythmic. like a lullaby. But deep inside his chest, something else stirred, an unease that refused to fade. It wasn't just pity. It wasn't obligation. It was instinct. Who was she really? What had been done to her? And who might still be looking for her? He looked once more at the sleeping child, the faintest shadow crossing her peaceful face, and felt the first pulse of fear, not for himself, but for her. The mansion that had been silent for 3 long years was no longer empty, but beneath the warmth of that fragile peace, something dark was already moving, unseen and inevitable, waiting to rise from the rain. The shadows of the past, the morning after the storm, was unnervingly calm. Sunlight filtered weakly through the windows, touching the marble floors of the mansion like something unsure if it belonged there. Daniel stood at the edge of his study, staring out over the city below. The skyline glowed gold in the dawn, but his reflection in the glass was a stranger. The same expensive suit, the same controlled expression, but something new in his eyes. Something that hadn't lived there for years. Behind him, the mansion was no longer silent. Faint footsteps echoed down the hall, the shuffle of small feet. The sound startled him. He wasn't used to it. Life in this house had been motionless since the funeral. Every noise had been an intrusion on grief. But now those sounds meant something fragile and human. He turned as the door creaked open. Laya stood there, barefoot, hair tangled, Daniel's jacket still hanging loosely on her shoulders. She looked at him uncertainly, eyes scanning the room before resting on the tray of breakfast near his desk. "I didn't know where to go," she said softly. "I woke up and thought maybe you'd left." The words hit harder than he expected. He moved closer, careful not to make her flinch. "I told you, Laya, I don't leave people behind." Her eyes lingered on him for a heartbeat too long, as if trying to decide whether to believe him, then dropped to the floor. He guided her to the chair near the window and handed her a plate. "Eat," he said gently. "There's plenty." She nodded, but as she reached for the food, her hands trembled. He noticed the faint purple marks on her wrists, old faded bruises half healed. His jaw clenched. "Laya," he said slowly, sitting across from her. "I need to ask you something. You don't have to answer, not if you're scared. But do you remember who hurt you?" The fork stopped midair. Her eyes froze. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then in a whisper so thin it was almost swallowed by the silence, she said, "He said I wasn't allowed to tell." Daniel leaned forward, voice steady but low. "You're safe here. No one can hurt you anymore." She shook her head violently. "If I say it, he'll find me. He always finds me." A chill swept through him, not from her words, but from the terror in them, the kind that didn't come from fear of punishment, but from experience. He had negotiated with men who had built empires from greed, but he had never seen this kind of fear, the fear of a child who had been owned, not loved. He didn't press her further. Instead, he stood and quietly left the room. That afternoon, Daniel called Mark, his head of security, a man who had once run intelligence operations for a private defense firm. "I need you to look into something," Daniel said. "A girl, about 8 years old. Found her on 4th and Mason last night." Mark paused on the other end of the line. "That's not exactly your usual investment, boss." "Just do it," Daniel snapped. Then softer. "Discreetly," Mark agreed, though Daniel could hear the curiosity in his voice. Within hours, his team was pulling traffic camera footage, missing person reports, and private registry data. By evening, Mark was sitting in Daniel's office, a thick folder in hand. He opened it carefully, the way men open things they wish they didn't have to. "There's something you should see." He slid a photo across the desk. It was grainy, black and white, security footage from an old apartment hallway. A man with unkempt hair, broad shoulders, and a face blurred by motion. His hand clamped around a child's arm. The timestamp was from 4 months ago. The child's face wasn't clear, but Daniel didn't need it to be. He recognized the shape, the small frame, the fear in her posture. It was Laya. His blood went cold. "Who is he?" Mark flipped through the file. "Name's Raymond Cole. Records long, assault, illegal confinement, suspected trafficking. No convictions. The system lost track of him 6 weeks ago." Daniel's eyes darkened. "So he's still out there?" "Probably," Mark said. "And if the girl escaped, he might be looking for her." For the first time in years, Daniel felt rage that wasn't rooted in business or betrayal. It was something older, primal, protective. "Find him," he said. "And if he comes anywhere near this house," his voice dropped to a whisper, "he doesn't walk away." That night the rain returned, soft this time, like a warning. Laya couldn't sleep. Daniel found her sitting by the window of her room, staring out at the storm. Her small hands were folded in her lap, knuckles white. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "The rain sounds like him," she whispered. When he came back angry, he slammed the door hard. It sounded like thunder. Daniel's heart ached. He crouched beside her, careful, gentle. "He's gone now. He can't reach you." "But he always finds me," she murmured again, her voice fading like mist. He didn't know what to say, so he did what he hadn't done in years. He reached out and wrapped his arms around her. She stiffened at first, unsure, then slowly melted into him. As she clung to his shirt, Daniel looked out at the storm, and for the first time, the sound didn't remind him of his wife's death or the hollow nights after. It reminded him of life, messy and unpredictable, breaking through his solitude. But as lightning flashed beyond the trees, something glinted in the distance. A faint light, brief but deliberate. Like the reflection of glass, a camera lens, Daniel's blood ran cold. Someone was out there, watching. He tightened his hold on Laya. The thunder rolled again, echoing like a promise. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The first smile morning broke quietly over the estate, sunlight slicing through the mist like a reluctant promise. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the world still smelled of it. Wet earth, clean air, a kind of rebirth. The garden glistened under dew. Birds sang softly as though testing the silence that had returned. Daniel Hayes stood on the terrace with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He wasn't looking at the view. He was watching the small figure in the grass below. Laya. She was barefoot, her small feet pressing into the damp lawn, her hair loose and wild in the breeze. The oversized jacket he'd given her hung like armor around her shoulders. She didn't move much. She just stared up at the sky, eyes half closed, letting the faint warmth of sunlight touch her skin. For a long time, Daniel just watched. Something about her stillness, this fragile girl standing in the light after so much darkness, struck him with an ache he couldn't name. She looked impossibly young, impossibly broken, yet the way she faced the world, quiet but unflinching, felt braver than anything he'd ever done. He hadn't felt something stir in his chest like that in years. When she finally turned, her eyes caught his, wide, uncertain but curious. The faintest ghost of a smile brushed her lips before disappearing again. It was so brief, so hesitant that Daniel almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. But he hadn't. It was her first smile. Later in the breakfast room, she sat across from him, tiny hands gripping a mug of warm milk. Daniel had insisted on simplicity, just toast, fruit, and eggs, after she'd stared at the mansion's full table the night before as if it were a battlefield. "You can have more if you'd like," he said gently. She nodded, eyes fixed on the plate. "I don't want to waste anything." "You won't," he assured. "There's enough here for everyone," her brow furrowed. "He used to say there's never enough." Daniel froze mid-breath. That one word, he hung in the air like a shadow. She caught his look and instantly shrank back as if afraid she'd said something wrong. "Laya," he said softly. "You can talk about him if you need to. You don't have to keep it inside." But she just shook her head, her hair falling across her face like a curtain. "I don't want to remember." Daniel's heart twisted. "All right," he said. "Then you don't have to." They ate in silence after that. But it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time, silence didn't feel like grief to Daniel. It felt shared. By afternoon, he had canceled his meetings. The empire could run itself for a day. He sat in his study, pretending to read emails while his mind drifted constantly back to her. Every now and then he heard soft footsteps in the hall, the cautious wanderings of a child still testing the safety of her world. At one point, she appeared at the doorway. "Can I come in?" He looked up, startled but smiling. "Of course." Her eyes traveled across the room. Shelves lined with books, the faint smell of leather and paper, a fireplace unlit but ready. She stepped in slowly, trailing her fingers across the edge of his desk. "Do you work here?" Yes, he said. This is where I try to solve problems. She tilted her head, thoughtful. Did you fix all of them? He hesitated. No, some things can't be fixed. Some things can only be understood. She nodded as if she knew exactly what he meant. Then her gaze fell on a picture frame turned face down on a shelf. She pointed to it. Who's that? Daniel's pulse stumbled. The frame hadn't been touched in 3 years. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached over and turned it upright. The photo showed him with a smiling woman, his late wife, and a little girl with pigtails laughing between them. Laya's eyes widened. She looks like me. Daniel's throat closed. He nodded, forcing a small smile. That was my daughter, Emma. She was beautiful, Laya whispered. She was, Daniel said quietly. You remind me of her sometimes. Something shifted in the air. Not grief, not yet peace, but something in between. Laya looked at the photo for a long moment, then turned to him with a look of pure sincerity. I think she'd be happy you found me. Daniel swallowed hard, unable to speak. That night he brought her a small notebook, wrapped neatly in ribbon. When she unwrapped it, she blinked in surprise. What is it? She asked. It's yours, he said, to write in. Or draw, or both, whatever you feel. She opened the first page slowly, touching the paper as though it were something precious. But what if I make mistakes? Daniel smiled faintly. Mistakes mean you're trying. She didn't smile back, not yet. But there was a flicker of warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. After she fell asleep, Daniel lingered outside her room again. He stood by the doorway, watching the rise and fall of her small shoulders under the blanket. She had begun to hum in her sleep, a broken little tune that sounded like something she was trying to remember. For the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel empty, but as he turned to leave, he caught a flicker of motion through the window. A shadow moved by the edge of the garden, too large to be an animal, too deliberate to be the wind. Daniel froze. The cameras. He rushed to his office, opened the security feed on the monitors. For a few seconds, all he saw were static-filled screens. Then one by one, they flickered to life. Most showed only trees swaying in the night breeze. But in one, near the eastern gate, there was movement. A man's silhouette. Watching the mansion. Daniel leaned closer, heart pounding. The figure lingered unmoving until the motion lights came on. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark. Daniel's reflection stared back at him from the screen. Eyes sharp, breath steady. The same man who once ruled boardrooms with iron precision. Only this time his enemy wasn't a rival corporation. It was a ghost from a child's nightmare. He looked toward the hallway, where Laya slept, safe for now, and something fierce and final burned through him. He would not lose another daughter. He would not let history repeat itself. But deep down he knew the shadow wasn't leaving. It had only come to remind him. The past wasn't finished with either of them yet. And when it returned, it wouldn't knock. The man at the door, the storm returned without warning. It rolled in from the sea like a living thing, swallowing the horizon and strangling the moonlight until the world outside Daniel Hayes's mansion was nothing but black wind and rain. The thunder came next, sharp, violent, close. It rattled the windows and sent echoes down the marble halls like the beating of a war drum. Daniel stood by the tall window in his study, watching lightning split the sky over the hills. His reflection stared back at him, cold eyes, clenched jaw, a man used to command. But tonight his authority meant nothing. For the first time in his life he was facing something he couldn't control. The unknown threat moving toward the girl asleep upstairs. He could feel it, a predator's presence. He wasn't a man ruled by instinct. Business had taught him logic, precision, patience. But tonight something primal stirred inside him. The air felt wrong. Behind him the fire crackled weakly. It should have been comforting, but instead, it threw long, twitching shadows across the room. Shadows that seemed to crawl closer every time lightning flashed. Then, through the hum of rain and wind came the sound that turned his blood to ice. A knock, not the polite kind. Not the hesitant kind. A slow, deliberate pounding. The kind of sound that didn't ask for permission. Daniel's eyes snapped toward the front hall. The security alarms hadn't triggered. That meant the intruder hadn't come through the gates. He'd walked right up to the door. A voice followed, muffled through the rain. Rough, slurred, dripping with malice. "I know she's in there." Daniel's pulse quickened, but his movements were deliberate. He crossed the study, opened a drawer, and pulled out the handgun he hadn't touched since the night of his wife's death. It was heavy, cold, steady in his palm, just like he needed to be. "Sir?" Mark's voice buzzed through the intercom. "We've got movement on the north camera. One male, early 40s, looks intoxicated." "Don't engage yet," Daniel ordered. "Keep eyes on him." He walked to the door himself. Each step echoed. Another knock shook the wood, harder this time, impatient, furious. "Daniel Hayes," the voice bellowed. "You think you can steal what's mine? You rich piece of—" Daniel's hand gripped the handle, but he didn't open it right away. He could see the man's silhouette through the frosted glass, broad-shouldered, soaked, swaying. A monster shaped like a man. Then he heard the sound that shattered his restraint. A scream. Laya's. High-pitched, terrified, from the staircase behind him. She stood halfway down the steps, barefoot in her nightgown, eyes wide and wild. Her small hands clutched the railing, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Don't let him take me," she cried. The man outside froze. Then he laughed. Low, guttural, the kind of sound that made Daniel's stomach turn. "There you are, you little rat," he snarled. "Told you I'd find you." Daniel's world narrowed to a pinpoint. Every instinct he'd ever buried roared to life. He opened the door in one swift motion, stepping into the downpour. The man before him was unrecognizable as human for a moment. Disheveled, filthy, his eyes bloodshot with rage and whiskey. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead. "She's mine," he growled. "You hear me? You can't just take her." Daniel's voice was ice. "You lost the right to call her yours the moment you made her afraid to breathe." The man's lip curled. "You think a suit and a mansion make you a savior? She belongs to me. She belongs to no one." The man lunged. Daniel reacted faster than he thought possible. Years of buried anger exploding through calm. He caught the man by the collar and slammed him against the stone wall. Rain drenched them both, the sound of thunder swallowing the growl that escaped Daniel's throat. Inside, Laya sobbed, her small voice echoing down the hall. Security rushed in seconds later, Mark leading the charge. They tore the man off Daniel and pinned him to the ground, his curses spilling into the night like poison. "Let me go," he roared. "She's mine." Mark's knee pressed into his back. "You so much as breathe her name again, you'll choke on it." Daniel stood above him, chest heaving, the rain running down his face. For a moment he considered ending it right there, ending him. But the sight of Laya trembling at the doorway kept him from crossing that line. "Get him off my property," Daniel ordered quietly, "and make sure he never gets near her again." As they dragged the man away, the storm began to ease. The thunder rolled farther into the distance, replaced by the faint hum of police sirens approaching. Laya collapsed into Daniel's arms the moment the door shut. She clung to him with desperate strength, her tears soaking through his shirt. "You said he wouldn't find me," she whispered. "You promised." Daniel's throat tightened, his heart breaking at the sound of her voice. He cupped the back of her head, holding her against him. "And he won't," he said. "Not again. I swear it." Her breathing slowed, but the tremors didn't stop. He carried her upstairs, her small arms still wrapped around his neck. The house felt different now, no longer just a home, but a fortress. That night, after she finally fell asleep beside him, Daniel stood by the window again. The rain had stopped completely. The world was silent, but peace no longer comforted him. He knew men like the one who had come to his door, desperate, violent, reckless. They didn't vanish quietly. They returned. As dawn crept over the city, Daniel picked up the phone and called his lawyer. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of a man who had made his choice. "I want full custody," he said. "Legal guardianship. Start the paperwork now." He hung up, staring at the sleeping child on the bed. Her face was peaceful again, but her peace came at a cost. And Daniel Hayes, once a man of business and power, now had a new empire to protect. Not of wealth, not of steel, of love, of one broken girl who had become his entire reason to fight. He turned from the window, eyes dark with resolve. The storm outside had passed, but the one inside him had only begun to rise. The courtroom of hope. The courthouse stood like a monolith of marble and shadow, cold, indifferent, ancient. Its tall pillars rose into the morning sky, glistening with the remnants of last night's rain. For most who entered, it was a place of law. For Daniel Hayes, it was war. He stood at the base of the steps, dressed in a dark suit that fit like armor. The world saw a billionaire. Sharp, untouchable, the man who could bend entire markets with a phone call. But inside, Daniel wasn't the CEO today. He was something much smaller, something much more human, a father. Beside him, Laya clutched his hand. She wore a pale blue dress his housekeeper had picked out that morning. Her hair neatly tied, though stray strands framed her fragile face. Her small fingers dug into his palm, trembling. Her eyes darted toward the doors of the courthouse like they might open to monsters. "Do I have to go in?" she whispered. Daniel knelt, meeting her gaze. "Just for a little while. You don't have to say anything. I'll do the talking." She looked at him with those same storm-dark eyes that had haunted him since the night he'd found her. "You promise?" He squeezed her hand. "I promise." As they climbed the courthouse steps, flashbulbs burst around them. Reporters shouted from the barricades, a frenzy of voices cutting through the morning air. "Mr. Hayes, is it true you're trying to adopt the girl?" "Mr. Hayes, sources say there's a custody dispute. Who is she really, sir? Is it true her biological father is alive?" Mark's security team moved fast, forming a human barrier as Daniel guided Laya through the chaos. She buried her face against his arm, flinching at every shout. The crowd was loud, too loud for someone whose life had been built around silence and fear. Inside, the courthouse was colder. The hallways were long and pale, smelling faintly of polish and paper. Daniel's lawyer, Alex Grant, a sharp but honest man, met them by the elevator. "It's going to be rough," Alex warned quietly. "Child Services isn't opposing you, but someone else filed a counter-petition." Daniel froze. "Who?" Alex hesitated. "Raymond Cole." Daniel's blood ran cold. "He's in custody. For now," Alex said. "But his attorney is claiming wrongful detainment and asserting biological relation." Daniel's jaw tightened. "He's not her father." "They're demanding a DNA test," Alex replied, voice grim. "And until that's settled, the judge can't finalize anything." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. The rage that rose inside him was cold, controlled, the kind of fury he used to destroy entire corporations. But this wasn't about money. This was about Laya. When they entered the courtroom, whispers rippled like waves through the crowd. On one side sat journalists and spectators hungry for scandal. On the other sat Raymond Cole, dressed in a cheap suit, eyes full of venom. He smirked when he saw Daniel, his lips curling in mockery. Laya froze. Her grip on Daniel's hand tightened until her nails dug into his skin. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He found me again." Daniel knelt, his face close to hers. "Look at me," he said softly. "Not at him. At me." Her small eyes lifted, locking on his. "He can't take you anymore," Daniel said, his voice trembling with restrained power. "I swear it." The judge entered and silence filled the room. The proceedings began. The opposing counsel, Cole's lawyer, was slick, confident, the kind of man who twisted truth into poison. "Your Honor," he began, "my client merely seeks to reclaim custody of his daughter, unlawfully taken from him by Mr. Hayes." The word daughter nearly made Daniel stand. His fists clenched, knuckles whitening. Alex rose, calm but sharp. "Your Honor, there is no verified proof of biological relation. Furthermore, Mr. Cole has a documented history of violence, drug abuse, and assault." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Cole, are you claiming biological paternity?" Cole smirked, leaning forward. "I raised her," he sneered. "That makes her mine." Laya's quiet sob broke through the courtroom. She buried her face in Daniel's sleeve. He wrapped his arm protectively around her, glaring daggers across the aisle. "Your Honor," Alex said, voice hardening. "Raising a child through fear and violence doesn't make one a parent. It makes one a monster." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Cole's attorney objected, but the damage was done. When the judge turned to Daniel, he stood. For once, he didn't sound like a CEO delivering a statement. His voice was softer, but every word carried weight. "I didn't take this child," he said. "I found her, abandoned, terrified, in the rain. She wasn't being cared for. She was surviving. I didn't plan to bring her home, but I couldn't leave her." He paused, glancing down at Laya, who clung to his arm like a lifeline. "I thought I was saving her. But the truth is, she saved me." The courtroom was silent. Every reporter, every clerk, every soul in that room leaned forward. Daniel continued, his tone breaking slightly. I lost my family 3 years ago. My wife, my daughter. I spent every day since building walls around my grief. Then I met Laya, and she tore them down without even trying. I'm not a perfect man, but I will protect this child until my last breath. Even the judge hesitated before replying. Mr. Hayes, she said gently, that may be the most honest thing I've ever heard in this courtroom. The hearing stretched for hours. Evidence was presented, photos, reports, psychological evaluations. Cole's record was laid bare, cruelty, police reports, neighbors' testimonies. By the time the sun began to sink behind the courthouse dome, the judge spoke the words Daniel had prayed for. Effective immediately. Legal guardianship of Laya will be granted to Mr. Daniel Hayes pending permanent adoption review. Mr. Cole, your petition is denied. Cole exploded, shouting curses until security dragged him out. His final words echoed through the courtroom like a threat. You think you can keep her forever, Hayes? You don't know who she really is. The judge banged the gavel sharply. Silence followed. Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. Laya's small hand found his again. Does this mean I can stay? She asked softly. Daniel knelt beside her, tears blurring his vision. It means you're my daughter now, he whispered. She threw her arms around his neck, crying. But this time it wasn't from fear. Outside, the rain began to fall again, softer this time. Not a storm, just a cleansing drizzle, like the world itself was letting go of its grief. But as Daniel carried Laya down the courthouse steps, unaware, a man in a dark coat across the street lowered a camera lens and whispered into his phone. They bought it. Move to phase 2. The storm wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The shocking reveal. The night the truth came out did not begin with thunder. It began with silence. Weeks had passed since the courtroom victory that made Daniel Hayes Laya's legal guardian. The mansion, once an echo chamber of grief, now thrummed with gentle life. Laughter, footsteps, the soft hum of lullabies played from Laya's small music box. But peace, Daniel had learned, was fragile. It lived in brief moments between storms. That evening he stood by the library window staring out at the garden. Rain threatened again. The air was heavy, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Behind him, the crackle of the fireplace mingled with the soft scratching of a pencil. Laya sat cross-legged on the rug, her notebook open, sketching something intently. Her brows furrowed, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Daniel smiled faintly, remembering the first night he'd given her that notebook, when she'd asked what would happen if she made mistakes. She had filled it since then. With flowers, stars, a dog she wished she had, with a small drawing of a man standing beside a little girl under an umbrella, him and her. Daniel turned back toward the window, heart aching in quiet joy. But then he saw it, headlights, 2 of them, moving slowly down the long private driveway. He frowned. No one was expected tonight. Security hadn't buzzed. The car's lights swayed, stopping briefly near the gate before creeping forward again. Mark's voice crackled through the intercom. Sir, there's someone here. Says she's looking for you. A woman. A woman? Daniel's pulse kicked up. Name? She wouldn't give one. Just said you'd want to hear what she has to say, and Mark hesitated. She mentioned the girl. The words hit him like a blow. The girl. Daniel's grip tightened around the windowsill. He looked at Laya, still sketching, unaware. Keep her inside, he ordered. I'll handle it. He walked toward the main hall, each step echoing through the marble corridor. When he reached the foyer, the door swung open. A woman stood in the rain. She was thin, wrapped in a long coat that clung to her like another layer of sorrow. Her hair, once blonde, was streaked with gray plastered to her cheeks. Her eyes, haunted but burning with purpose, locked on Daniel's. You're Daniel Hayes? She asked, voice trembling. He nodded slowly. And you are? The woman stepped closer. My name is Mara, she said softly. And the girl you call Laya, she's my daughter. The world tilted. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. The rain hit the pavement like 1,000 whispering voices. He tried to process the words, but they bounced off the walls of disbelief. That's impossible, he finally said. Her biological parents are not dead, Mara interrupted, her tone breaking. They were silenced. Her hands shook as she reached into her coat and pulled out a photograph. Creased, water-damaged, but real. It showed a child, younger but unmistakable. The same pale hair, the same frightened eyes. Laya. Daniel took a slow breath, his heart pounding in his ears. Explain. Mara's voice trembled as she spoke. 3 years ago, my husband and I ran a non-profit organization, helping children escape trafficking networks in Eastern Europe. We were investigating a group that funneled kids into illegal adoption rings. They found out. They burned everything. My husband was killed. I was left for dead. And my daughter, she swallowed, her voice breaking. They took her. The words hit Daniel like shards of glass. She's not just a lost child, Mr. Hayes, Mara whispered. She's a witness, and someone doesn't want her to remember. Daniel's blood ran cold. He remembered the fear in Laya's eyes, the nightmares, the fragmented words. If anyone found me, they'd send me back. She remembers more than she lets on, Mara said. That man, Cole, he wasn't her father. He worked for them. He was supposed to keep her hidden. But he turned violent when she tried to escape. Lightning flashed. Daniel's reflection flickered in the glass door, and in it he saw himself. Not as a businessman, but as a man standing on the edge of a truth that could destroy everything he thought he knew. Why come to me? He asked finally. Because they know she's alive, Mara said, and they know you have her. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Where is she? Mara's voice softened. Please. I need to see my daughter. Daniel hesitated. His instincts screamed caution, but something in Mara's eyes, raw and broken, made him nod. When Laya saw her, time seemed to stop. She froze mid-step, her sketchbook slipping from her hands and scattering across the floor. Her small face went pale, confusion flooding her expression. Laya, Mara whispered. It's me. It's Mama. The girl didn't move. Tears welled, trembling on her lashes, but she didn't run forward. She stood still, trembling. Her eyes darting between Mara and Daniel, between the mother she didn't remember and the man she had learned to call father. Daniel's heart fractured in two. Sweetheart, Mara said softly, kneeling. You used to sing to the stars with me, remember? You called it our secret sky. Laya blinked and bowed, and suddenly her lips parted. Secret sky, she whispered. Mara's tears fell freely. She opened her arms and Laya stumbled forward, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. Daniel turned away, his chest tightening with an emotion too complex to name. Grief, joy, fear, love. But even in that moment of reunion, he saw something that made his stomach drop. Through the window, at the far edge of the property, a black SUV idled with its lights off. The past had caught up, before Daniel could react. Mark's voice came through the comms, tense, urgent. Sir, multiple vehicles approaching from the west gate, armed. Daniel's gaze snapped to Mara. They found you, he said. Her eyes widened. No, they found her. The lights outside flared, the sound of tires screeching cutting through the night. Laya clung to Mara, terrified. Daniel's instincts took over. Take her to the safe room, he ordered. Now. Mark and the guards moved fast, ushering Mara and Laya down the hall as Daniel turned toward the front door, rage burning through fear. He had faced boardrooms, rivals, and betrayal. But this was different. This time, it wasn't about profit or pride. This was war for his family. And Daniel Hayes, the man who once built empires with contracts and cold blood, would now fight with fire. The storm roared back to life outside. Rain lashed the mansion walls like applause for the coming chaos. The final battle for Laya's safety had begun.